The magazine industry expanded partly into the advent of the railroad, able to much easier to deliver. This in turn improved literacy rates. It was actually pretty revolutionary because this was the first time we had a real mass medium. Because remember, yeah, they had newspapers, but the magazines were different because they were able to be marketed into a lot of different markets across the country. So this is where we really see it at a major level from the print standpoint. We had new technologies with new printing technologies. Delivery was better, so then this made more people interested in reading. Now there were some real big developments in magazines. This woman, Sarah Josepha Hale, she started a magazine. Yes, a woman in that time. It was in the first half of the 19th century, so it was a big deal. A woman first started a magazine, and it was exclusively targeted towards women. Prior to this, it was more for men. And the first magazine that she came up with was Ladies Magazine. It had general interest articles, but it also advocated for women's education. That was a big deal back then. Unfortunately, at the time, women were not considered to need an education. We've come a long way since then, obviously, but she was one of the first early people that advocated that through these magazines. She knew how important education was, and she specifically targeted women, and she would bring up things in the magazine to educate women of lots of different things going on, different topics, different issues, and this was very revolutionary. She also, advocating for women's right to work in the workforce, and also to own property. She, for a while there, had some success. Then she took that ladies magazine and merged it with what was called Godey's Ladies Book. This brought together some resources, and she did that for the next 40 years. She edited that magazine for the next 40 years. Godey's, as it was called, was known for fashion illustrations, plus all the previous advocacy that she had been working for so long with her first magazine, Ladies Magazine. Eventually, the magazine circulated to about 150,000 subscriptions across the country, which was revolutionary. And so this was a big deal for the time. Also, at this time was an influx of illustrations in magazines. This was brought into magazine publishing, and prior to that, it was just basically printed words. Didn't really lend much to it. But then you started seeing things, forms of illustration, drawings, engravings, stuff like that. These started becoming the norms. They wanted something more than just words. Now, newspapers were mainly words. They wanted to make themselves different, so they brought in illustrations. And then once later on, the Civil War popped up, and photography, the still camera, was invented, and Harper's new monthly magazine. They started with battlefield sketches, but then eventually the Matthew Brady, well-known photographer, documented a lot of the Civil War with photography, for early parts of photography, and we see that this is the first time we really started seeing photography, and it was big because it was during the Civil War. But the strange part about that is, yeah, they started with that. It took a while for the magazines to pick up. It wasn't until the 1890s that it started becoming mainstream with using photography in the magazines. So now we see how magazines have developed. Now we have a graph here. We can see how it's grown. Heck, in 1800, it started off as just 12 magazines. 1825, 100. Heck, and then we get up to 600 in 1850, 1200 to 1870, And by 1890, there are 4,500 in 1890, and after the turn of the century, 6,000. You can see that right as you're looking at it right now. The growth of the magazine industry with all these new factors and technology and the industrial revolution and distribution and circulation, it's exploding. The circulation is exploding. Magazines becoming more and more popular with the American culture. You had faster presses, new technology with distribution and delivery, and as a matter of fact, because they were able to circulate more, they would bring down the cost of the magazine. And this is where we start seeing with the cost of the magazine. What they would do is they would include new advertisements in the magazine. So now when you look through a magazine, why there's so many different advertisements, you keep going through the magazine, turning the pages, it's advertisement after advertisement after advertisement. This is what they this is how they decide to make it more profitable for them. Heck, we can make it cheaper. We'll just get more advertisers. So this is a big reason why we see so many advertisements as we do today. So things are becoming more easier for the magazine industry. The Postal Act of 1879 comes around. It made it cheaper to mail. That increased the circulation. And then also the rise of a magazine that is still being published today. Go to any supermarket, you'll find it. You can get a subscription to it, the Ladies' Home Journal. This is a big deal because this is the first magazine that reached 1 million subscribers. It's a bigger deal because its main target audience are women. Now, one of the big things also with the rise in the circulation, it also happened to be at the same time we had major social changes within the United States. It was the Industrial Revolution, lots of industries such as the meat packing industry and other industries across the board. Yes, they were growing from a business standpoint, but there were a lot of issues with that because there were a lot of labor issues, a lot of safety issues that people didn't hear about until the rise of magazines. Newspapers would never get into the in depth about these issues so much. Not to say newspapers didn't cover it, but the magazines had the ability to do the more in depth, full investigation than the newspapers with their daily deadlines. This gave, and so we had much more information about it. They got to really focus in on those stories. With that, you can have lots of illustrations and photography as well. And because of this work that they did, and they were called the muckrakers because they were able to rake out the muck. They were able to get behind the scenes of these industries, and their acts of journalism, their investigations brought about the Pure Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act, antitrust laws. These were all things in part due to the work of the magazines. So this was reflecting, the magazines were reflecting the time. So, such things as McClure's magazine. They did an investigation on talking about the history of the Standard Oil Company. And this goes to the whole antitrust and monopolies. They went and this is where we start to see some antitrust laws being brought about. And this is really where we start seeing the distaste for monopolies in this country. And it's in great part due to the magazine industry. The person who came up with the whole muckraker title was former President Teddy Roosevelt. All right, as time goes by, we start to see a rise of what are called general interest magazines. They took on a broad number of topics out there. This started becoming popular starting around after World War I and going straight into the 1950s. It did combine, partially some internet investigative journalism, partially broad topics, but the big aspect of this was photojournalism. Photojournalism became a very big part of the of this rise of magazines, this type of magazines that became so popular, even though radio was overtaking newspapers in a lot of different ways. The fact that the magazines put so much stock into the whole photojournalism aspect, the picture of photography, and it's become such a huge aspect of it. It was very much rival was a very big rival for the radio industry. So they were holding their own. We've already talked about the Saturday Evening Post, but Reader's Digest, which is still around, Time and Life magazine. Reader's Digest, well, their big thing was they were able to condense. They condensed lots of articles, lots of stories, and people generally like that. Sometimes they don't have the time to read as much as they want. They just want to kind of get the idea. So that was the popularity of that. Some older customers still today still have Reader's Digest at their home. And it was such a big deal that the fact that it was condensed, it was cheap, production was cheap, so they were able to it did not cost that much for the Reader's Digest. So this was popular for a lot of people. Circulation went to over 1 million magazines for this, which is pretty good when you think about it's cheap to produce, and Reader's Digest still around today. So it happened to work, and it worked. It was a big deal because it was part of during the Great Depression and up until World War II, and it still kept going, still out there today. But their circulation has gone down. Still, an older demographics tend to read that. But it's still kicking. It's still out there. Another one was Time magazine. I know you're very familiar with that, especially from a journalistic standpoint. That was began in 1923. Henry Luce and Britton Hayden. They came up with a magazine with interpretive journalism. They had reporters, research teams, and they wanted to cover stories, and they put it in a narrative form. It was interpretive, and at the time, in 1930 time, out of the circulation about 200,000, and by the mid 1960s, it was more than 3 million. So it exponentially grew. It grew and it grew, and then it's inspired other magazines such as Newsweek, U.S. News, and World Report. Those are two more recent news magazines you've become more familiar with, and Time magazine is still out there, a major staple. So they're doing a pretty good job as well. But the other one was Life magazine, and they were really very much a big part of their attraction to people is their photojournalism. This is Life magazine. Getting Life magazine was a big deal. People would flock to the newsstands and get it, and the thing about that was it would be passed on. Someone would buy it, and someone else would take a look at it. And mainly, the main attraction was the brilliant photography, the photojournalism going on there. It took it to a whole other level. It became its own sort of phenomenon in a much simpler time. It documented things from the 1930s during the Depression, then it definitely took off during the World War II. Some of the most famous pictures of all time of major historical figures come from Life magazine. Life magazine seems to come and go. It's gone out of business. It's come back, but the photography has always been the mainstay of what what people really seem to be attracted to. That type of magazine with Life magazine.